Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Patt with the Hudson Institute's Center for Defense Concepts and Technology, and I'm thrilled to be joined here this evening by our two guests. Let me introduce them. First, we have Jamie Morin, who is the Vice President of Defense Strategic Space at the Aerospace Corporation, and also the former Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, or CAPE, at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD. We also have with us David Norquist, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Defense Industrial Association, NDIA, and he previously served as Deputy Secretary of Defense, as well as the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. So, our two guests this evening have excellent experience for our topic at hand. Our topic tonight is the congressionally mandated Commission on Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, PPBE, reform. So our two guests were commissioners here, as well as they have extraordinarily relevant career expertise as we dive into this topic. And tonight, we want to focus really on one aspect of what you got into. And this aspect is that of the budget structure. So projected behind us, we have a graphic of the budget structure, the cube, if it will. And maybe I'd like to open by asking you guys to explain. David, we'll start with you. Can you briefly explain, what PPBE is, what the budget structure is, and how it came to be?
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about it.
So if you go back enough in time, you have the Congress appropriating money by office, right? And so the basic funding was to a particular office or organization that used it for that purpose. So not the structure that you see here. Over time, particularly with the standing up of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the merger of the services into a department, you had not only the desire to be able to see things across the organization, but also if you budget 1 year at a time, which is most federal agencies do, most federal agencies do single year budgeting, you can't plan out, right? NASA can't put a man on the moon by budgeting 1 year at a time. They have to think out X number of years and work backwards. The same logic applies to the Department of Defense. If I want to stand up an air wing with a new airplane, I have to look out several years. I have to have the facilities ready by that time. I have to have the equipment, and you work backwards. And so part of the drive originally to do a PPBS structure was to allow you to make your strategy more relevant and to have a vision of where you're going to and bring it backwards to the present. What do I do now to be ready for that in 5 years? And this is really a reflection of the long-term challenge of keeping up with the Soviet threat as the pacing challenge at the time and building a system of the dead. So that was sort of the origin behind this. And what I'll do is I'll let Jamie sort of talk through the first two letters of the planning program, and I can talk you through the budgeting execution. Because fundamentally in the jobs that we've had before I was deputy, that's really the way the process would flow. We'd start in his world and then come visit mine.
That's excellent. We'll do that. I'll just note there, you really described two things. There's sort of external purpose, right? Congress has the power of the purse.
Yep.
And so it's this tool to interact with Congress, between the executive branch and Congress to figure this out. And then there's this internal process around setting priorities and putting resources against those priorities.
Correct.
Is that fair?
It is true. And the cube is mostly driven by Congress, the way the appropriation paragraphs are written. And the process is almost entirely internal to the department, which is many of the things are later mandated by Congress, but it really refers to how the department goes a process of building what it's going to ask of Congress.
Excellent. So let's turn to the acronym PPBE, and let's break this down. Tell us about the first two letters, the role of CAPE, and set the stage for our discussion here.
Sure, and let me start by establishing my very limited planning bona fides, which is I interned in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Requirements and Plans Office. So my apologies to my planning colleagues who spent whole careers in that field. But I did start there. The Department of Defense operates seeking to align resources to strategy. Right? And over the years, we have changed what we call our strategy. We're now in an environment where we develop a national defense strategy. It's a document with a public aspect and a classified annex to it. And it lays out really, how the nation manages ends, ways, and means. The planning process into the first P of PPBE is a sort of interim step, which is grasping at the strategy, looking at the gaps between the strategies and the ability of the national capabilities to deliver against them. And it identifies a series of focus areas, a series of investment areas, a series of areas to take risk at a fairly abstract level. In practice, we produce a document now, it's called the Defense Planning Guidance, and that document lays out a series of instructions from the Secretary to the department about where to put resources, also what topics to study, what issues to delve into, and in many cases also sort of what is the analytical yardstick that'll be used to measure the force? What are the pacing challenges we want to prioritize, and how would we assess our capability against them? That top level, and I'll say written in words kind of guidance needs to move into specific detail of how do we align resources, both human capital and dollars, to individual military mission areas. And that is the primary role of the programming process, which in the Department of Defense, since the era of Melvin Laird, has focused on a submission that comes from individual submitting entities, most notably among them the military services and departments, but also various defense agencies and other stakeholders. And those submissions then are evaluated in what's called a program review. It essentially amounts to an opportunity for all of the various stakeholders to look at how the submissions from the other stakeholders might affect their equities or their concerns. Did the Air Force reduce its investment in airlift aircraft, and does that reduction put at risk the ability of the Army to deploy forces? Yeah. Did the Air Force shift aircraft in its proposal from overseas bases to domestic bases, and in doing so, lengthen the timeline required to deploy forces for a contingency in that overseas area? Those are the kinds of topics that would come up, and individual stakeholders would have a chance to raise critiques essentially in front of the Deputy Secretary, or eventually, if necessary, the Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah, yeah. But these processes, I mean, do you feel core to the very existence of a civilian Department of Defense over the military services?
Well, that's right. And David mentioned up front, right, with the 1947 National Security Act and the additional changes that happened in 1949, as we're really building our first peacetime national security state and the institutions to provide military capability, not just in time of war, but every year, if you will, preparing for sustained competition. One of the critical issues that came up is first, the rudder authority, if you will, of the newly created Secretary of Defense and the national military establishment that eventually became the Department of Defense was pretty weak. Yeah. As he said, those resources were aligned to individual offices and activities, and they weren't terribly transparent to the senior leadership, which gave them very limited ability to let national level strategy drive resource allocation. Yeah.
So there's an important distinction, because you've listened to, he described the process and the trade-offs and the choices and the challenges. None of those yet get bound by the concept of procurement, R&D, and O&M, right? Because you're still at the programming level, and you're answering the questions the way the leadership would ask them. What is my trade space? What are my choices? How does this fit to the strategy? When you get to budgeting and execution, what you have to do is you have to operate within the way that the Congress writes the law. So go back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, no funds shall be drawn from the Treasury except in accordance with appropriations made by law. Those appropriations are written in a paragraph that says the time, the purpose, and the amount. This amount for this purpose, and those paragraphs define the boundaries. And the things you're seeing on the top and the side, not necessarily the middle, are the way the Congress writes it. Procurement, R&D, research, development, Army, aircraft procurement, Air Force. Well, for the comptroller's office, then you have to organize your office, you have to organize your documents in accordance with the manner that the Congress receives it, and then when you spend it, the services have to organize their spending in accordance with that structure, because that's the way the law is written. So the reason this comes back to it is, as a commission, when we looked at this, we said, there's a great deal of translation that goes from, I need to trade space between these major concepts and these colors of money choices. And what we found is often when you go to the Hill, the first thing the Hill says is, well, I don't see all the money that's in there for this program. And the answer is, well, it's not, because it's spread across all of these different colors, which means it's in all these different books. And so you get a question, well, can you give me a briefing that pulls it all together? And so one of the things we flagged early on in this process was, we don't have a budget structure that matches the way people traditionally make decisions. And we go from decisions, figure out what the structure looks like, translates it back to a decision, that builds time and delay, but it also removes transparency for the department and the Congress, because the things they're looking for are spread across multiple books.
Yeah, fair enough. So then in this long historical arc, you sort of hinted at a long time ago, an appropriations bill would have largely focused on organizations. Organization is still somewhat a dimension of this cube, right? We see the military services broken out, but the primary structure in an appropriations bill is now activity, or the colloquial term, right, color of money.
Right.
And you hinted at, the major categories are what? Research, development, test, and evaluation, RDT&E, procurement, operations and maintenance, and so forth.
In the commission's nomenclature, we talked about that as life cycle stage.
Yeah.
Right. So R&D before procurement, before operations, and then the personnel to conduct the operations. We found that was a good way to kind of conceptualize how our current structure works. It's not perfect, but that's really what those appropriation titles reflect.
And at first blush, maybe it seems reasonable to try to separate out research and development from procurement, because you would never want to enter a state where you only buy things and you never invest in the future, right? That sort of seems like a reasonable trade. So what are the incentives that you see? I mean, on the other hand, you mentioned it tends to break up activities and it tends to maybe make responsibility or accounting diffuse.
Right.
What are the incentives that are implied by the current cube, by the current budget structure?
So whenever you write an appropriation paragraph and you say, I'm going to draw the line around RDT&E Navy, what you've said is, I'm going to put the walls so that it's easier to move money within this area and harder between it. So that means if I have a program, a weapon system that has both research and procurement, I'm both fielding a system and upgrading it, that program manager has a wall between those two abilities. They can move money within with some more flexibility, but if they have to make a choice between, I need some more money for a research upgrade, I can't, because it's trapped on the other side. And so the question that we as a commission asked is, are these walls really in the place where you want them? Is this really, are you trying to block a program in research that's ready to move? And one of the biggest challenges is software, right? And many of the colors of money reflect a very traditional industrial process. I research something until I'm done. I come up with a design, somebody builds me 100, I'm done, I go into maintenance. Software doesn't look like that.
Yeah.
In trying to ask somebody developing software, in 2 years when the budget's enacted, is the software you're writing going to be an upgrade? Is it going to be a patch? Or is it going to be a new capability? And the software writer looks like you're an idiot, because they can't tell you that now, and chances are it's probably going to be all three. And so software is one of the ones that kept pointing out, this is a very old assumption about the way the world works, and you are probably building barriers between things you want to have go quickly and separating things in areas that don't actually matter to Congress, so they're not helpful.
Yeah, one way to think about this is, how low in the organization do you want to go before people can stop consulting lawyers to figure out how to spend money, right? So right now, with an acquisition program that is sitting in, with activity that falls in what we call today research and development, activity that we call today procurement, activity we call today military personnel, operations and maintenance. In all seriousness, the program manager there and the financial managers for that program are making legal judgments with advice of counsel on an almost continual basis.
Right.
Because understandably, as David said, Congress has the power of the purse, and those appropriations are provided for a specific purpose, for a specific time, and in a specific amount. And we have government officials who are accountable down to very junior levels for ensuring that all funds are expended in a consistent way with the purpose, time, and amount for which they're appropriate.
Yeah.
The decision about how to chop that up drives a great deal of activity.
And I will just use one example of distinction, which is for many of our research labs, this was viewed as such a problem. The legislation was changed, and they do almost everything with RDT&E. They pay their people with RDT&E, so there's not a separate color of money. They do their maintenance, they do their equipment purchases. Now, no one in that group has to go to a lawyer each time they want to buy something. What they have to ask is, do I have the available money, and is it consistent with my mission? Both perfectly good questions. Whereas every other organization, well, is this an upgrade? What is this? So
yeah, and I think we'll there's this thread of like how do we ensure accountability, which I think we'll return to a little bit later. But this is an important element of this discussion. Walk us through. The commission had a broad charter. We won't cover everything the commission did. Why you chose to tackle this? I mean, this is so foundational. It's so ingrained. How you structure the budget. How did this come up as a priority for it? What drove that?
So there's a couple of things, which is when we first started, it wasn't clear how much you had to fundamentally change the system to get it to go where you want it to go. So we started with many of the very traditional reforms. But this example here, the fact that you had to have a separate office who did the programming side, who looked at the data one way in order to answer the question from the secretary, and therefore had their own rules, their own data sets, and their own information, who then had to hand it off to the comptroller shop, who had their own office, their own data, their own rules, their own decision trees, in order to reformat the data. Well, if you don't change the data structure, they will never be able to function or share or overlap in the way that you want them to, because you've built this translation in the middle, right? We're going to start with French, we're going to end with Spanish. At some point, you have to have a translator. So there was a series of those that came up where we realized you will not get the speed or the reforms that you want unless you change some of these underlying factors.
Yeah, I mean, if I could be blunt here, I would say, as a commission, we had a lot of members with deep, deep experience in the processes of the department as they're practiced. Not everybody. I mean, we had a member of Congress as a commissioner. We had other folks who worked primarily acquisition. But many of the commissioners were really deep in the current system. And frankly, when we first sat down, we started with a lot of narrow ideas, getting at very specific pain points that we'd all seen, or several of us had seen, and we had thoughts about how to fix them. It took us a while. I mean, we listened to well over 1,000 stakeholders in the course of the 2 years of the commission. I think it was over 400 sessions of interviews or listening sessions, open mics. And I would say we were halfway through the process before we started realizing it was not going to be sufficient to come up with a few dozen rifle shot ideas to address specific pain points. And we needed to, both on the formulation process, what we now call the defense resourcing system in our recommendation, and on the structure of the system itself, the data structure of the department, we had to think significantly differently about both. And that, I actually give David a lot of credit for helping to lead the commission toward that view as part of a working group he led on the strategy to budget linkage. We thought about it, we benefited from his expertise as a former deputy secretary, where he had to support decisions for the secretary on the really big choices facing the department. And that's a little different, right? That's a little different than even the job as a comptroller, or my job as Air Force comptroller, or as CAPE director. You're coming at it from a different lens, and it helped us, I think, to pull back and say, wait, do we need to make a more substantial step away in order to drive behavior that will maximize military capability with each taxpayer dollar? And so we migrated to that point.
Yeah, and I think that's a great time, Ray. If you can pull up our alternative slide set to start, pivoting to the work and recommendations of the commission. And David, you hinted at there's this core. You can think about the structure as it's a kind of data structure. It's a model you're using to exchange not only between legislative and executive, which is a key thing, but also inside the department, right? So there is a coupling between the system, the working through how we resource the department and this budget structure. Do you want to talk us through?
Sure, let me walk through, because one of the things that we ended up doing is you realize if you make all the changes that we're talking about, it's no longer PPBS, right? And so we recommended changing the title to Defense Resourcing System. But let's go to one more slide. So when we looked at what we wanted out of the process, you wanted to make sure it's strategy driven, you wanted to promote agility, you needed to respect the oversight role, you really wanted to make it founded in analysis, but you didn't want to center it on distinct and separate phases. In fact, if you go back to the origin of PPS, the acronym is what drives the phases. The original set of principles, there's no mention of phases in them. It talks about everyone having a shared set of information. It talks about choices between fully priced out alternatives to make sure that there's valid pros and cons. It's looking at multi-year costs, not single year. So the principles are what one needed to protect. The phases were just a side effect of how it was set up. So there's a couple of changes. The first one is at the front end. Often the department kicks off the process after you go through from the strategy into it by developing a memo, the defense planning guidance, that goes out, and it's on a good day it makes tough decisions. Frequently it becomes more of a consensus, but it's a written document, but not that many leadership meetings beforehand. Mostly it comes after the service POMs come in. And what you traditionally find in most reviews is the secretary gets jammed for time, right? Yeah. And the arguments and the discussion between the services and the department all occurred after the services have built their POMs and not prior to. So one of the big pushes from the commission was you have all these war games, you have all this analysis going on during the year that are providing insights as to the change in the threat, the gaps, and so forth. Those should all be presented in the winter to a DMAG-like forum, and that should be used to inform the guidance that goes to the services. So if there are things you know you want, the services can see the challenge, they can see the gaps. And now when the service positions come in, you're much closer to what everyone is looking for, and there's less of this trying to, now we're going to sort out the different visions of the future. So that's one of the key changes that go from the strategy to the resource allocation, is you start with that up front. The second one is in the resource allocation phase, you had programming and budgeting, which moved around in what it meant, right? I mean, at one point in time, PA&E and comptroller were in the same office, and the processes were sequential. Then they were separate offices and sequential. Then they were separate offices and tried to be simultaneous. And in the different ways, the problem you ran into was the one we encountered, which is the way that the first phase looks at the data and the second are different. And we saw here 2 databases, 2 sets of decision documents, which creates a lot of challenges for the services. Very hard to see whether or not you're balanced because 2 different offices are making changes. And the view is if you can get to a single calendar with a single decision ground of truth, you can go to different forums, right? There's a different way you resolve an issue that cuts across multiple services and has a large technical aspect versus one that's a single command request, right? You can go to different forums, but you want that cross-cutting. So in the resource allocation decision phase, we really tried to be able to take advantage of, if you did this change, you'd be able to remove a lot of duplication. And you're not going to get speed without eliminating duplication. And so those are the basic things that gives you basically a strategy, a resource allocation, and an execution phase. You reduce the number of documents and steps, which helps to speed it up. But the thing we realized at the end is, there's a lot of people who spend a long career in the Pentagon who get assigned to other places and come back. If I called the document the same name in the process, you'd eventually revert back to what it was where you were last time. And so unless you change the name, you shouldn't expect people to plan on doing something. We've done this for 60 years, right? The notion of falling back on the traditional habits is going to be very strong if there's a change in administration. Every 2 years, a military person rotates out. The person who comes back may have well done this 4 years ago, 8 years ago. So you have to have a way of signaling people, it's not that, right? And what it is in order to get them there.
Yeah. What do you think? How does this change the translation into the details? How does this DRS affect how CAPE would go about its job of analysis?
Yeah, so The acronym CAPE can sometimes confuse people as to what is the organization primarily focused on. It stands for cost assessment and program evaluation, and it indeed does both functions. But the dominant thing that the Secretary of Defense looks to OSD CAPE to advise on is the military effectiveness of the joint force, right? You have military services inside military departments who are, because of their training, because of their responsibilities, naturally motivated to focus on their individual domains and capabilities. And this organization is there to help the Secretary look across the whole and understand how it fits together. Yeah. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Staff will provide best military advice on the effectiveness of the force. But when it comes to sort of the detailed modeling of how do these capabilities stitch together, what is the return on investment in terms of the ability to deter or win fights, that's what the program analysis team and the analytics team in CAPE is really focused on. That has to be underpinned with realistic understandings of what it takes to deliver capabilities, because as David mentioned, the core principle in PPBE is you have to be putting like against like, right? If we match a PowerPoint deep idea for how to go do something against a engineering level of detail plan for how to do the same thing, it's very likely that the optimism in the PowerPoint deep version is going to be higher, and we won't be comparing apples to apples. Right. So the organization is sort of dedicated to how can we get these difficult balancing decisions into as close of a common currency as possible, where the measure is military effectiveness.
Right. So let's talk about how this then translates into your proposed budget structure and the role of major capability areas. Is this the appropriate visual?
Yeah, I think this is a great way for Jamie to lead off with and walk you through what this looks like to the world.
Yeah. So as we discussed up front, we have throughout most of the Cold War operated in an environment which was focused on life cycle phase and focused on program level activity within those life cycle phases. And you see on the left-hand side of the chart here, the structure starts with the life cycle phase, and then the services or components, then what we call budget line items. You see they all have codes associated with them, and then oftentimes individual projects inside those budget line items. In the appropriations eventuality, those first two elements become the title, the appropriations title and the appropriations account, and those are legally binding. The department requires scarce transfer authority to move dollars from one of those to the other, as well as approval of the Congress of this specific reprogramming action. So both transfer authority and reprogramming approval. Below that level, there's reprogramming processes that allow dollars to move among activities, but which still in many cases, depending on the dollars involved, requires congressional approval, but does not consume that scarce transfer authority. So we've laid out in the commission a recommendation for a structure that, as we say, flips the cube. And so that cube picture you showed earlier, we kind of turn on its side, and we really do focus more on management structures, where do you have accountable officials, and then what we call major capability or activity areas. So the top level in the budget and the appropriation as it's asked for, and again, we envision this being a common data structure that could support both programming decisions and budgeting decisions, getting at that efficiency and frankly, leadership mental bandwidth, right? The challenge of having spent 3 months deliberating issues in program terms and then walking to Capitol Hill and explaining them in a new set of data structure is not frankly a fair thing to ask of the deputy secretaries, the service secretaries and chiefs and so forth. But so we start with the components, the major players. Those are all big organizations. They have, sides of the Pentagon with lots of offices and leadership aligned. Then the major capability and activity areas. And the reason we focus on that is we believe both the Congress and the leaders in the Department of Defense understand there are some big chunks of the department that everybody cares about. And if I am the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, I am looking for what are the undersea capabilities available to me from the Navy. That's an important variable. If I am a congressional advocate of shipbuilding, I care about that chunk of things too. And there's a long list of folks that care about those. So we've proposed a serious and multi-player dialogue between the department and the Congress on the definition of these major capability or activity areas. Because this needs to be a win-win, right? The Congress has a absolutely legitimate constitutional role. And the department has a sacred trust to do the best it can with the taxpayer dollars and the blood of the service members that are executing missions. These are those are both completely valid roles and concerns.
Yeah.
So, but it shouldn't be zero sum. Right? It turns out, if I get to control the things I care most about and you get to control the things you care most about, we can both be happier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if instead I am dealing with my day-to-day management tied up by a whole bunch of things that neither of us care about, we are both worse off. And so what we think is we may be able to get to a win-win here where more than the multiple stakeholders can see things that actually matter. We're accounting for things that actually matter. The lawyers are sort of much less engaged because the accounts are the things that people are already organized around.
Yeah.
So below the level of those major capability or activity areas, we identify systems and programs that would still be budget line items, right? So we're not saying, Congress, you don't get to see the difference between the F-35 and the F-15X. Those would still be major programs, and they would still get their own line items. And you would still have to reprogram if you wanted to move between one and the other. But you wouldn't be transferring.
Yeah.
And then below that, we understand there are still very good reasons you want to know how is a major development program progressing through its life cycle. Right? It's useful information for everybody if a specific shipbuilding program is still stuck in early stage research when we had a plan that would have it be much further along.
Yeah.
But we make those display totals. Those aren't the control totals that you have to go through legal processes to move across. They're reporting. And so we think that addresses sort of the critical information needs on all sides of understanding how things are developing and progressing without turning this into a legal dance. Yeah. So that's kind of our laydown, but I do want to just come back to the critical point, which is we did not come down from Mount Sinai with stone tablets etched with exactly what these capability areas have to be. We provided a couple of illustrative examples, some sort of proofs of concept, but it's got to be a dialogue because this proposed reform is dead if it turns into one branch or the other trying to kind of end run the other side's legitimate constitutional role.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I hear is this, this is not agility in the wild. We maintain this really strong emphasis on analytics in the department, and this is analysis from strategy. This is as well as analysis of spending. But at the same time, the structure is a step, it feels like a little bit more of a step to the historical, more organizational structure, right? The top level is a service component structure, where, as you said, Jamie, there's a management structure aligned around that. Maybe there are accountable officials aligned around that. Tell us a little bit about what the deliberation around getting to this was like. What alternative, how easy was it to come to agreement as a commission that this was a recommendation? I recognize you table some of the details, like what are the major capability areas, but as you present it, it sure sounds obvious. This is important. We should rearrange this. Tell us a little bit about those processes and different ways you considered.
I mean, it was an extremely difficult moment for the commission, in part because my handwriting is terrible. I mean, we had a large whiteboard, and people were going up to the board and were sketching on it. Yeah. And unfortunately, some of the sketching was mine, and we required interpreters to make sense of it. No, so it was an iterative process, and this is one that we had a handful of really spirited meetings where people were were throwing out big ideas after we got to that point where we said, wait a minute, it's not enough just to do these rifle shots. David, you probably have thoughts
Here's a
too.
particular example, which is you need to balance trying to improve the visibility and the decision-making with how the money actually moves. So one of the questions, well, let's just take this to its proper conclusion. Let's link mil-pers to the people in the F-35, right? So let's show you not just the F-35 program, but here's the maintenance cost of the program, here's the number of military personnel assigned to that program, and then you can see in one place the full cost of fielding this air wing. That had a real appeal. But here's the problem. Mil-pers is centrally done. And it's done by the person's name. It pays the person whichever assignment they've gone when they move 6 months into the year. And to try and tie people to systems, to a budget line, knowing the money never does that, you'd have actually taken a big step backwards. I mean, one of the things about the military personnel account is it pays the people. If there's a vacancy, it doesn't get paid, and it's all managed centrally. Civilian personnel is actually funded through O&M because local offices can hire civilians, not hire civilians, use contractors instead. So when you try to take it to the ultimate end of tying every single color of money, and MILCON, of course, crosses committee jurisdictions. So the view is, a number of those, while theoretically appealing, have either structural problems or fundamentally, the money wouldn't act that way, and to try and pretend it did in the budget briefing will confuse people because the money doesn't actually flow. So that's why we started, if we start with R&D and procurement, you start with those systems, it helps the Hill see both sides of the program. It helps it see it through its life cycle. The transparency is actually dramatically better, and it doesn't have the negative side effects of presenting the money one way when the system doesn't actually spend it that way.
We had some interesting dialogue. We quickly realized putting mil-pers in with the major capability areas, with the other major capability areas would be a problem for all those reasons David laid out. We had more detailed discussions about how much of what we today call operations and maintenance belongs in those areas. Mm-hmm. And so what we've laid out in our recommendation is sort of those dollars that are most closely associated with, say, a major weapons system or its maintenance, we think can go there. Those that are of more general applicability, the contract to mow the lawn at the base, those don't. Yeah. There's value to keeping those in a significantly smaller but still highly flexible pot.
Good. Just as a side note, I was earlier today at the Marine Corps celebrating their clean audit opinion. Well done, Marine Corps, thank you. Great job. But one of the things that comes up with this is because of the way we currently divide the colors of money, it does not match the accounting standards. So the program management office that oversees the weapons system is paid for out of O&M, and they pay the rent out of O&M. But accountants in the commercial sector say that's part of the capitalized value of the asset because you had to pay that program management office to exist. So when the department goes to value its F-35, its procurement line is not an accurate representation of what it needs to do. So one of our suggestions is you need to align these. You need to either change the accounting definition or you need to change what you allow the program office to pay for out of, because then your system will actually give you a single run that will answer that question. So part of what makes the audit harder is we're drawing lines in places that don't matter to the Hill, but create differences between the government's budget financial system and the way the standards are written for what you have to account for. It's just a side effect, but we're just trying to figure out, there are other problems you're generating with this that can be closed by bringing things into alignment.
And again, is there anyone that benefits?
Yeah. Is there any upside that they're paid for out of a different color of money in a different account? Right. And the answer is no. The Congress will still know how many people they have, what they do, whether or not they're performing.
Right. So one of the things that's implied here is, so you've stated clearly several times.
He's saying we're repeating ourselves.
No.
Are we repeating ourselves? No.
I think we're repeating ourselves.
Well, I think this is a really foundational point, the appropriations time, purpose, amount, right? Mm-hmm. This is a contract. This is a contract between legislative and executive branches. And what we're implying here, one of the goals that the Commission report talks about is agility. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a view that maybe what budget reform should do is just flexibility writ large. Mm-hmm. And that's not what you're saying. And in particular, I want to focus on agility, right? The budget structure that you laid out says, I don't have to go to 4 committees for approval to advance to new phases of a life cycle. I absolutely do have to go back to the committees for approval if I'm going to rebalance between undersea capability and surface shipbuilding, let's say, whatever those major capability areas, right? That's implied of, that gives you agility within those capability areas. Is that right? I mean, how should we think about the potential benefits and what are the risks of this?
So I think that is right. I think what you're trying to do is to say, in places where Congress wants you to move quickly, does the system allow you to move quickly, or does the system put a brake right where they don't want one? So just imagine you've got a program who's in research, they're going to start procurement, and the Congress has said, based on where you are, we think you're ready to, you'll have enough, so to be in research for 6 more months and procurement for 6 more months, and at 1 a year, 1 a month, you can buy 6.
Right.
Now you're in the middle of the year. You've moved faster. You're ready to go into procurement a month earlier, or you're ready to go to procurement a year later. Well, now the program actually hits the brakes while it tries to get the R&D and the procurement switched around. Well, the Congress didn't want them to hit the brakes. The Congress wanted them to move. Now, if the Congress didn't want it to go to procurement, it would say 0, right? And the answer is Congress gets to define the numbers. But if the Congress wants them to move, the fact that they can get hung up because they were ready to go to procurement earlier, or they needed to do a little bit more research and now they're dead in the water till they get it, those are not supporting congressional intent. Those are actually creating problems because of the way we drew the line, right? The only thing I would, when you ask what are the risks, the single risk I always flag is you run the risk that somebody takes your new set of controls and leaves the old one in place and gives you both. And now somebody's trying to play with a matrix complication where all the rules are there and nothing's gotten faster. And so the answer is that's not it.
The four-dimensional hypercube instead of just.
But if you can get to the point where the committee is able to draw the boundaries around the things that matter, have the information it needs, see them all in one place. I mean, part of these divisions is now they mean they're all in different JBooks, right? If I need one, I go to the RDT&E JBook, and I go to the procurement JBook, I get the O&M, I pull them all together, I open them all up, and then I try and figure out how much money is being spent, and I use a calculator to be able to tell my boss. That's not helpful to the committee, right? So that's the thing, which is part of what makes this work is remembering that at the end of this, it should be helpful to the committee in doing their job and supporting their membership to understand what they're voting on.
Yeah. So what DoD has, tried, as everybody knows, it's a trope, right, that it's tried acquisition reforms. It's also had a few cracks at things around the edges, around budgeting reforms and process reforms. What's different and what's the same? Where do you see recommendations of the commission, especially around budget structure, but maybe other things like the defense resourcing system? Why might they work, and what are the challenges associated with getting some of the recommendations implemented?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we've laid out a fairly comprehensive set of reforms, and part of the challenge that I think the department and in particular the appropriations committees, but also the armed services committees have had with past efforts here is that it's been sort of a series of eaches to address perceived issues, and those do tend to move to a more zero-sum, winner-loser kind of calculus, right? Either the reprogramming threshold goes up and the department has more flexibility, or it goes down and has less, and Congress sees more These are sort of tried and true, or put differently, these are hills the department has charged up before and been repulsed on. So I think a really big part of this is we are laying out a series of interrelated recommendations that we think as a whole is better on both sides, as opposed to, let's arm wrestle over this one particular issue where we understand who wins and loses. That's a big piece here. I do want to be really clear, though. Congress has the power of the purse, and under this structure, there's nothing stopping the Appropriations Committee from writing a provision that says no funds may be obligated for activity X, regardless of whether it fits in one of these categories, right? I mean, they can say you're not allowed to arm the Contras, right? And then the executive branch is not allowed to arm the Contras.
Yeah.
So this is the fact that something is not a stipulated control total in the appropriations bill doesn't mean that Congress cannot exercise control over it. And I think that's a very important point because we cannot predict the things that Congress will care about in the future. Again, the question is, what's that fundamental data structure that everybody is living in every day, whether or not anybody cares about it in that particular year?
Yeah, we've spent a bunch of time sort of, grappling with the questions of agility and accountability here. We've made the case that maybe it's not a zero-sum game. There are actually some win-win scenarios here, which I think is really appealing. And we've spent a lot of time talking about, what the role of the Congress is. To what extent did you or other members of the commission engage with congressional stakeholders on these ideas? And what kinds of feedback did you get?
Yeah, I mean, significantly. So significantly we engaged. We had regular touch points with all of the defense committees multiple times through the 2-year process of the commission. Most of the members of the commission were, of course, appointed by members of Congress. I was appointed by the then chair of the House Appropriations Committee. And so, we weren't getting weekly phone calls from our appointing members, or at least I wasn't. No. But we certainly, understood that this commission was created by Congress with a majority of the commissioners appointed by Congress with intentionality. The views differ, of course, right? Yeah. Everybody's touching the elephant in a different place. It feels slightly differently from each perspective. And I think what we really benefited from was a chance to do that active listening with the congressional stakeholders, but also with the executive branch folks, both at the senior level, right? I mean, we met multiple times with Deputy Secretary and the DoD Comptroller and service leadership, military and military department civilians, but also the GS-13s try to make this all work. And that's where we actually picked up a lot of the biggest frustrations, because people felt they were trapped in a system that didn't let them be fully effective. And they saw inefficiency in allocation of taxpayer dollars. They saw inefficiency in allocation of government and military staff time because they were fighting process instead of fighting the enemy. And so we didn't take every recommendation that we heard in those meetings, but the sense of the times, the frustration, that helped to motivate us to start thinking, how can we take this up a level? How can we get a bigger picture solution? It is, but we have a slide. I don't know if you can pull it up. Sure. It gets at the 28 overall recommendations of the commission.
That's right here.
And I just highlight there's 5 buckets here. And one of the critical buckets, the bucket that is central to the whole thing, is strengthening the relationships between the two branches of government. You got to have the data foundation for that dialogue to be substantive, and you have to have the people who can implement and make this happen at scale. Because it is not enough to have a super-powered, amazing counter-IED task force that has no-color money that lasts forever and all the best people, because there's hundreds of American soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors dying. That we're really good at solving those crisis problems when they happen. But the fact that we can solve those crisis problems when they happen does not mean the system is working.
No.
So one of the things I just point out is, we have a number of members of the commission who had served in the department, positions like ours on the PPBE as mechanics of it over there. But we have a significant number of members of the commission who had been, we have a member of Congress, we had people who are authorization committee staff, I and others were appropriation committee staff. So many of us were able to put ourselves in the position of, when I had that job, what does this work for me? What were the issues I had? And I think it's very important for us when we went through this, and we're very clear inside the commission, that the congressional committees, both the authorizers and the appropriators, both work very hard to try and make the system run faster, to try and be responsive. And the number of times where there was an issue because someone was not doing something right, and therefore it's not the resistance, it's a memory of how this has been done improperly in the past. But Appropriation Committee raised the reprogramming thresholds in order to make it more effective this year. There was an issue with ISRs in the past where they provided a pot of money to the department to allocate according to the department's priorities against ISR requirements, and said, we're not going to try and guess them, you figure them out. So when they buy the problem and they see the relevance to national security, they are very good about working with you. You just have to be able to explain what the problem is and why this is a compelling solution. I think it's one of the things the committee tried to focus on is this is going to be successful when the committees believe it's to their advantage to make the change. They're going to get better data, they're going to get clearer information, and the nation will benefit. It's not going to work if one group is trying to pass something over the other. Those never work on these types of reforms, and some of the biggest successes came from everybody playing well in the sandbox.
Yeah, I would commend to your audience here. There's a couple pages at the beginning of the FY24 defense section of the Omnibus Appropriations Bill that was enacted just a few months ago that lays out many of the steps that Congress has taken in appropriations bills or in how it conducts its business to enhance the agility of the department, to respond to emergent challenges. And it's a very nicely written and laid out litany of how this is an ongoing journey where there's a recognition of the urgency of the times, the nature of the strategic challenges we're facing, and imperative to prepare for competition, and how, in particular, appropriations committees are adapting. I think our argument from the perspective of the commission, and we wrote our report before that was written, but I think our argument is those are incredibly important steps that have been taken to work within the system we have, and they speak to how the system can get after critical challenges that get high visibility. But there's a funnel problem, right? The department is over 3 million people. It's pushing $900 billion a year, and we have to operate at scale as a nation in our Department of Defense. And so we've got to figure out both how we can address those urgent crises hand in hand, one nation, one fight, and also how we can conduct the day-to-day business of the taxpayers and the warfighters in a way that delivers better outcomes. And so we think there's room for both that immediate responsiveness and motivation that the Congress laid out in that bill, and this shift in both internal DoD process and how we think about the data.
So as we wrap up our panel here, are there any closing comments that you'd like to share with our audience?
So the first one I'd suggest for those in the audience, if this is the world you live in, right, you can help participate in this conversation that's going forward. One is make sure you understand the recommendations so that if you're in positions where you can implement or take advantage of them. The other is if you're either your think tank or analysis group, we did not lay out a particular architecture because we wanted to make clear to the Congress we were trying to do that. But outside groups can come up with all sorts of variations and be able to show the committees, here's an option A, here's an option B, in order to help them envision different alternatives to see what works for them. So for others, they may find that an interesting project or area to work on in order to start to help to unveil the different options before them.
So for example, what would be a proposed laydown of major capability or activity areas?
Right.
What would be the things that would fall within them? DoD is going to have to do some of the nug work, right? We have a couple thousand budget line items right now, but we would love to see as commissioners folks come forward with ideas for that, and I suspect the congressional committees would appreciate getting multiple ideas in as well as that dialogue hopefully starts. I did want to say one important point. We've talked a lot about the Congress here today. The commission was making recommendations, some of which are quite challenging to the department as well. And I think you'll see significant chunks of our report where we're critical of how internal choices in the department are making the job harder than it has to be. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on that side as well. I will say I have been extremely pleased with the degree to which the current Deputy Secretary, Kath Hicks, has embraced the recommendations of the commission. She, when we put out our interim report, she first took a detailed briefing on it and then immediately turned and directed the staff to start implementing the list of go do now items that we had recommended. That was enormously gratifying, and frankly, I think that also gave the commission some greater ambition as we moved forward to work to our final report, because we realized actually somebody's going to read this and they might do something with it. It was flattering and motivating. So thank you, Kath. But then she's also set up implementation team to get things started on the final report recommendations. And again, I'm sure there will be some of these 28 that they say, you know, they're crazy, and that's okay. That's okay. But I think the fact that they've been serious about this is a huge deal. The just introduced Chairman's Mark of the House Armed Services Committee bill for FY25 creates a IPT or a cross-functional team of some sort to look at these recommendations inside the department. Again, we view that as very positive. It is, but I would say again to your audience, to you here at Hudson, to David at NDIA, we need a really sustained conversation among the defense and resourcing communities about how we can make this system work better. There are a lot of people working hard to succeed inside the system right now, but we are making it too hard for them to succeed. And this effort needs to be, we need our effort focused on how do we get the most effective military we possibly can. Out of every dollar the taxpayer invests, there's not going to be a ton of additional money pouring down on the department over the next decade. So we've got to get smarter. And this is one small piece of that, right? This is of strategic relevance. And so it's an important effort, and we really appreciate the chance to continue the conversation.
I find that really compelling, right? What seems maybe a little nerdy, you know,
It's a lot nerdy.
It's a lot nerdy, fair enough. Yeah, let's just admit it, is really of strategic importance, certainly in this time. So with that, I'd really like to thank you, Jamie, David, our audience. And with that, I'm Dan Pat. Thank you again for joining us.